Hello, everyone. I'm going to carry on this A14 therapy session. Um, I found myself being dropped into the A14 project quite early in the analysis phase. I'd spent a decade in academia. This was my kind of first proper commercial job, or certainly, since over a decade and a half, since I'd completely given up the ridiculous notion of working in commercial archaeology. And it was also the first week of the first COVID lockdown. So I had quite a bumpy introduction to the A14 and the analysis phase. So in the talk today, I'm obviously going to be talking about the post-excavation analysis phase for the A14, but I particularly want to reflect on the reasons why we expect so much from these mega projects. I think we're completely right to expect a lot from these mega projects. And that's not just because they've got massive budgets and they've got huge economies of scales, but actually I think there's something slightly more fundamental about these kind of projects, and that comes down to scale. So everything we do in archaeology kind of hinges on scale. And we can go from the individual right through to kind of whole regions, and we can do fascinating and insightful and high quality research at any of these scales. But as archaeologists, we do tend to focus on one particular scale, and that's the scale of the site. And that's not really unreasonable because we spend most of our time excavating at that scale. So it's kind of natural to expect that's reflected a lot in our research. And whilst we all recognize that no individual settlement or monument was ever in isolation, it was always a node in a network of cultural and economic and social ties, the examination of the role of the site in its broader context and how it relates to other sites, other nodes, is often a comparative study that happens at the very end of a project, often in the discussion, or even externally in an academic synthesis project. And indeed, that's what I primarily did in academia, is take a load of individually studied sites and try and derive new meaning from them. So what these mega projects do is they actually open up that inter-site scale as part of the primary knowledge creation. So while there always will be scope for those kind of external synthesis projects, what these mega projects do is allow us to interrogate at these higher scales as part of the initial of the project, and start opening up different kinds of things we can talk about. So I've decided to represent the A14 pictorially. I don't think we actually had any whalebone, but that's right. I mean, you've heard about the project already. It was really, really big. And that was the environmental assemblage as well. 9,000 samples, 4 tons of animal bone. It was a big project. I think probably a better way of depicting it, and particularly given that we're at the CIFA conference and a gathering of archaeological professionals, is by the sheer number of specialists. So these are all the environmental specialists that were involved in the A14 analysis. With sincere apologies if I've missed you off, or I've missed someone off. I may well have done unintentionally. And as you can see, it was a lot of people doing a lot of different things, and my example is very similar to Sarah's. Actually, most projects you'd expect to have one archaeobotanist. We had 9. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to start off by talking about kind of 3 lessons that I reflect on about how we operated the project and how we managed to do the work that we did. And then I'm going to reflect on 3 things that really allowed us to kind of tap into that higher scale level of analysis and say some new and interesting things. So I've completely changed the word consistency and changed it to standardization to make it sound really interesting. So when we do inter-site comparison, we kind of normally do it, like this over here. We look at different sites by reading a bunch of different reports written by a different set of people under slightly different methodologies, and we decide how relevant and how comparable the results are to our own work, our own site. Now, what we did, of course, for the A14, what you have to do for these mega projects, and Emma's already talked about this, is you kind of move to this model, which is you move the joining up to the start. So you take your specialists, you agree a methodology, you then stick all your data in the same database, and then you've got this nice consistent result. And it wasn't quite that easy. But that was the principle. What I would absolutely say was that the absolute saving grace for the A14 was the fact that we did use a database and that all the data was going into this one database. And the reason that was so crucial was because that kind of forced an element of structure onto the data creation. Otherwise, we could well have ended up with a bunch of completely disparate site reports. I was surprised, I'll be honest, the level of methodological variation within specialisms. Maybe I was being naive, but one of the things we really had to work on was kind of standardizing those methodologies so that we were all doing the same things in broadly the same way, so everything we did was comparable. And I think my big lesson for that was really to kind of get ahead of it and reduce opportunities for ambiguity as early as possible, and essentially making as few assumptions about the way people worked. Now, I do also have to kind of speak about the database. For anyone who was involved in the A14, you can ask them about the database and you'll hear mixed opinions, not all positive. That database has now been completely surpassed by a much, much better product. But I think there was some really good lessons that we could learn about the use of the database. And like I say, it was absolutely crucial. For me, I think where we had the least friction with the database use was when the design of the interface, and Sarah mentioned this as well, aligned really closely with kind of the existing ways of recording. Essentially, if the database bent to the needs of the specialist rather than vice versa, it was generally easier to get buy-in from specialists and then reap the benefits of having a joined-up database. And I will point out, so this on the top right is the Archaeobotany data recording entry form. It's a case in point. I think if I got 100 archaeobotanists in a room and asked them to sketch out what a recording sheet looks like, I'd get 100 fairly similar looking sketches, none of which would look like this. So that did pose challenges, and it was difficult for some specialists to adapt to it. Personally, I loved it, but not everyone did. But on the flip side, very same project, the charcoal recording form, that was developed hand in hand with the charcoal specialist on the project, and that was absolutely amazing and worked like a charm. So it's just to really emphasize the point that, you know, if we have the tools and resources orientated to the needs of the specialists, then generally we get things going much smoother. Right, on to sampling. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes. Oh, brilliant. Yeah. I'm going to start. I forgot to start my watch. Sampling. So, obviously, we've already talked about sampling. It's a really critical part of the analysis program. We can't do everything, and even if we could, we wouldn't want to because we really want to focus on the stuff that's the most interesting. And making really sound selections at sampling really depends a lot on having quality assessment data. And that data is often produced in a hurry, rapidly. It can be quite crude, but I think it's worth emphasizing that actually investing in top quality assessment really makes making those judgments better, and it means that you can do better quality and better value archaeology at the analysis phase. For the environmental analysis, we actually have a nice case study for the A14 because for the plant remains and the animal remains, we took two very different approaches. So for the plants, we had kind of 9,000 samples. We ended up analyzing about 10% of those. And the selection of those was done based on specialist recommendation. So think of this as a kind of a moment in time approach, where we went where the specialist in question went through all of the assessment data and made selections, and that felt good because it was really aligned to specific research questions for specific sites, and it worked fine. For the approach for the animal bones, we did something slightly different, which is what this big coloured table is on the side, and that was more of a rules-based approach. So what we did is we had our target amount of animal bone that we could analyze. And so we applied a series of rules. There was about 7 rules in the end to select up until we had enough bone to meet our target criteria. So for example, the first rule was we would analyze all contexts, all the bone from all contexts that are dated to the Iron Age, dated pre-Iron Age and Anglo-Saxon. So that took up a chunk. And then we would analyzed contexts that said had exotic animals in it or had particular species at particular periods and stuff like that. So this felt slightly more detached from the research questions. And the research questions kind of had to be baked into the rules. The advantage was that when the inevitable rephasing happened, for the botanical samples, we then had to kind of reconsider in a somewhat subjective sense about whether each sample, now that it's been rephased, should or should not be included in analysis. Whilst for the animal bone, it was a little bit simpler because we could just apply the rules. Now this context has been rephased. Does it meet our selection? So I think both obviously have their merits. But the rules-based one was a little bit easier to cope with, and as Sarah has already mentioned, those issues with rephasing as we went on. The last of my three kind of operational lessons is about the reporting. There was obviously a lot of reports, as you've already heard about. Each of the 8 landscape blocks had their own environmental reports, and that's for each different environmental specialism, so there was an awful lot. This little graph here is I did a little study to compare the word count of the reports to the size of the assemblage. And I got this nice little exponential relationship, which really demonstrates the point that not only when you have a larger assemblage can you say more, which would be a linear relationship, but actually you can say more types of things, so then it becomes exponential. So I thought that was quite nice. But what that actually masks is that there was quite a lot of variability in the report. So whilst the length was about the same, they did vary a lot in terms of the content. Now, when I was deciding how to give guidance out on the environmental reporting, my view at the time was to give people plenty of creative freedom so that they could write the report that best reflects the assemblage they had in front of them. And I stand by that decision. But perhaps, we could have done more to kind of set a kind of minimum standard of these are the topics you need to at least touch on and cover on. And it's kind of illustrated by those 2 word clouds of the top 60 interpretive words from 2 different archaeobotanical reports from the A14. What you'll see is that one really focuses on crops and crop processing and agriculture, whilst the other one is much more focusing on ecology and individual context. So I wouldn't want to kind of impose strict reporting structures onto specialists because each site and assemblage is different. But also we need to, maybe ensure that there's sufficient standardization that when we come to compare these reports, in the same way we standardize the data, it's easier to compare like with like. So we overcome these problems. We have this huge assemblies. What did we do? We told you that the Romans grew spelt and they kept some cattle. This is a rather flippant point that it's often leveled a lot at environmental archaeology, is that, do we really tell you anything new? Stuff you already knew, right? We know the Romans had a load of spelt, So, I personally think we said an awful lot more than this. This isn't the forum to decide that. As you've seen, all the data and the reports are up online. I'm going to go forward on the premise that we did say some interesting things beyond this, and I'm going to just finish off by talking about 3 areas where I think we did something that enabled us to say those more interesting things. The first was this dedicated synthesis stage. Now, obviously, this is not something you normally see on an archaeological project, but once all the analysis reporting was completed, we had a specific synthesis stage. And this, to me, was really crucial for integrating, making sense of all the vast amounts of data we generated. In the case of the environmental program, it was myself and Vicky Ewens from MOLA, and we reviewed all the plant and animal environmental data to build an overarching synthesis. And this was a cross-period approach, and it really complemented those kind of landscape block and period-specific reports that Emma's mentioned. It really fitted into those quite nicely. It really allowed us to smooth out the kind of inconsistencies in individual reports and then really ensure we had comprehensive coverage of the entire screen. And I think it provided for a lot more cohesive and insightful narratives and allowed us to address the research questions at that really broader scale. And the fact that all the data was in a single database really allowed this to actually be quite a data-led approach. So, because it was just so accessible was the data that we could really get the most of it. And some of the proudest things that we did for the environmental assemblage for the A14 really came out of this phase, actually, just bringing it all together. The second is engagement. Now, the A14 had a really, really wonderful engagement program, and you're going to hear about that later this afternoon. I just really wanted to pick out one facet that I was directly involved in, which was the vegetation model, and particularly its presentation as a story map. Developing a multi-period landscape-wide model of past land cover is not something well, it is something that's typically beyond the range of a commercial project. We actually teamed up with colleagues from the University of Hull and to undertake pollen modeling and took a multiple scenarios approach to integrating all the wider environmental and archaeological data. And as the famous saying goes, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think in the case of the A14, whilst it's certainly not a flawless model, I'm pretty confident it was useful and informative. And this was especially true when it was presented as an ArcGIS story map. It really provided the context of how the complex modeling process was undertaken, and it gave you kind of an interactive way of exploring the model. And I was struck by not just the members of the public that engaged with it, enjoyed, but actually people writing up site reports and period specific really engaged with it, and quite a few of them came back to me and said how they found it really useful that as they're talking about a site or a period, to be able to visually see the landscape reconstruction for those particular periods in this way. So I think my main point here is that, if we're going to do archaeology at the scale of a landscape, then we really ought to be thinking about the nature of those landscapes. And I believe the approach we took with the vegetation model in the A14 is something that, with refinement could definitely be used on many future projects. Right. The last of my, do we go over time? 1 minute, yeah, just about that. Last of my three things is what I call science-based archaeology. Now, I like to think of all archaeology as science, but really what I'm talking about here are those optional, additional things that we do after the standard analysis, and they largely involve a machine that goes bing. Now, notably, the A14 had a large ancient DNA analysis program, a very comprehensive plant, animal, and human stable isotope program, and SEM scanning of food remains. And all of these could be considered as optional extras that you don't actually need to do, but they really did form a core part of the analysis. And when integrated with those more traditional analysis techniques, generated some of the most kind of exciting and informative insights about the project and the people that lived in that area. Really, the thing I want to emphasize here, and this maybe refers to the question about what we can do earlier in projects that we had, is that, getting these techniques into projects, into budgets early on and be mentioned in UPDs, for the A14 was really down to the vision and the ambition of just a handful of people. One person in particular was on the academic panel and is no longer with us, sadly, was Lisa Lodwick, and she really had an incredible vision to drive stuff like this into it. Angela Walker, another person, is sadly no longer with us, who was the environmental lead during the assessment, also very open and worked well with Lisa to kind of integrate some of these things. So, driving these forward and getting these kind of research techniques involved, I think they added immeasurably to the quality of the research that we put out. So my very final slide is my kind of free summing up take-home lessons. Remember, we're playing a brain game. So archaeological analysis, it's a creative exercise that relies on human intellect. So we really want to create a setting and the tools that allow people to thrive and do their best work. This relies on communication and collaboration, but it's also relies on appropriate levels of standardization so that we can show that we're all taking comparable approaches to our different challenges. Rely on data and automation. Thank you. The scale of these mega projects is such that even tiny inefficiencies can cascade into exhausted budgets. So reliance on technology, frees up time for people to do that creative work. And it's also where databases with intuitive tools such as predefined taxonomies, automated tables and graphs, and even AI input, really pay dividends. And finally, we need to be open and ambitious. It's an enormous privilege to be able to work on projects of this scale. We should be open to trying new things in new ways, and these kind of new ideas, initiatives, technologies, they can not only improve efficiency of projects, but they can also open up whole new avenues of research and ideas. And a big part of that is making sure, as we've seen already, that these projects, the data needs to be out there for the public to engage with, because that in itself brings fresh perspectives. Thank you very much.